Welcome to the Trails Around the World podcast. Each episode inspires you with a new idea for a long-distance trail or an adventure, someplace interesting in the world that you can discover. We tell you why you want to go and tell you how to make the dream a reality. Joe Guglielmetti, welcome to the Trails Around the World podcast. Thank you for joining me on this episode. And today we will talk about the Maine Island Trail. Maine Island Trail is different from the other trails that I've discussed on this podcast, most obviously because it's a water trail. In fact, my understanding is it's the first water trail, or the original water trail. And the way it works is that there's a nonprofit organization that makes deals with private islands and public islands along the Maine coast. People join the organization and are able to access information about those islands and at the same time agree to responsible use of those islands following leave no trace principles, and the organization maintains the islands to some degree, keeps an eye on them, and there's a large element of stewardship involved in that interaction, in that relationship. Did I get that right?
That is all correct. There is also the Maine Coast Heritage Trust, which is another organization that maintains separate islands that are also considered part of the trail. That's one thing to clarify, is that the trail is not a defined specific path.
Right.
That you can create different varieties of stops and campsites along your way, depending on how you want to move along the coast of Maine. A big reason for that is that the shape of the coast of Maine is jagged. There are a lot of necks and archipelagos and islands that make it so that you can draw different lines on your way. So you may end up not exclusively using the Maine Island Trail Association's islands, but yet still complete the coast of Maine. But everything you said is accurate. So that, and the Maine Island Trail Association certainly is, you could do the entire coast only using their island, their in quotes, because you did explain it well, that they don't own the islands, but they do maintain the islands. And another thing they do that's important is they update annually a guide to the coast, including details about the islands that they upkeep. And with a membership to their organization, you get a hard copy and also access to an app that's a guide to the islands. And they will also include some information about the Maine Coast Heritage Trust Islands. And then beyond those two organizations, there are state-owned and community-run islands that are campsites, and then private campsites that you can pay along the way. So there's many ways to connect the dots once again.
Right.
But I do like that you use the word steward. That's a great word, and I think they use that well. So it's really a partnership, and you'll see along the coast the most heavily used islands that Maine Island Trail Association is the steward of will actually have caretakers who live there. So they are a liaison between users and the organization, and I think that's a great resource. So they're really proactive about teaching leave no trace ethics and skills that you might need, and some of the natural habitat, kind of identifying what's around you. And I really like that they do that. They pay someone to be there on those really heavily used islands.
So, Joe, tell us something about your background and your adventure resume.
So, adventure resume is something I have not officially put together, perhaps because it's an adventure resume. So it's mostly my adventures have been less structured than locating a trail and hiking it, but I've had plenty of adventures. I'd say growing up, certainly an outdoors person. My dad worked in the outdoor industry, and I was exposed to that. I was taken camping before I really knew what it was, and I've always been very comfortable in the outdoors. And I think the first thing I would put on that resume is that I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Zambia, and that brought plenty of adventures. Being in a rural sub-Saharan African country, there just existing was an outdoor adventure most of the time, with unique challenges. And being an American in that environment, my skill level rose quickly just with understanding how to exist in the natural world in a place where existence itself took a lot of energy every day. Everything from diet to fending off certain insects to maintaining shelter. And it was a very beautiful experience. And within that, I found a lot of adventures, mountain biking and hiking, places that weren't necessarily mapped very well. I would at that point use the satellite to kind of figure out where I wanted to go and meet people along the way. Then I got more. I've been a paddler for a long time, but I got more into sea kayaking when I returned from being overseas, and kind of took it to the next level where I got a lot of training. I became a Maine guide. I became an ACA instructor, eventually a BCU certified paddler, and I started to find a lot of paddling adventures. The most notable was that I went down to Fiji and paddled around Kondavu Island. I did a solo unsupported circumnavigation of Kondavu Island, which is remote. I camped in the villages along the way, and that was quite an eye-opening adventure. The people of Fiji are, I think, what a lot of us aspire to be culturally. They really are connected to nature in a special way, and by necessity, but also by culture. And they have a way of approaching the natural world that I learned a lot from. Just the way they treat the coral reef, the way they treat the hillside. It has to be in a sustainable way because there's limited land, there's limited resources, and
right.
So remote that you can't depend on importing things. You have to really, when you're in a Pacific island nation, you have to take care of your land and yourselves without an expectation that you're going to have a boatload of resources coming in. So just being around that, I spent a month in Fiji. I spent a lot of time not paddling as well, just learning from the villagers and going to the school and listening to some of the chiefs talk about what they do. And I had a really positive experience, and that was probably my biggest paddle adventure so far. And some others that are more minor but were very exciting. A friend of mine and I circumnavigated Manhattan, which is kind of a juxtaposition with what I just described, but also a beautiful trip, because to paddle around one of the most densely populated places was, I guess I forget that no matter how much we pile humanity into one space, the natural world is still there. And to paddle around Manhattan, but realize that it's replete with nature, that we coexist with nature even in those places. It was a really beautiful thing. And
how
then
long did that take you? How long did it take to paddle around Manhattan?
It was an interesting trip. The tide is super important there, because you have the Hudson River and the East River, both have powerful currents.
And Spite and Dival at the north end, right?
Right. And so the friend of mine and I, she's also a guide and a good paddler, and we actually took a tandem kayak because we figured, let's just use a tandem. It'll be a little faster. And we made we actually looked up the I believe it was a Columbia University crew team's tide current diagram, because they had mapped out really accurately. Right. And we planned the trip really specifically around the tide, but then the morning we were going to leave, or it was actually the evening before we were going to leave, we found out that there was going to be a regatta in the Hudson River, and they were actually going to close the New York side of the river starting, I believe it was like 8 a.m. And we realized we had to switch directions. We were originally going to go counterclockwise, but now we had to go clockwise. So we had to leave early, but then we managed to have to race up the Hudson, then fight the tide in the Harlem River. But then we also hit the maximum ebb tide in the East River. So when we came through the notorious Hell Gate, it's like class 3 whitewater,
Wow.
which was super fun. But also the timing of it increased, I think, how fast we went, because we had to race up the Hudson and then we also flew down the East River. So ultimately it was about 7 hours, which it's 32 miles. So that's moving pretty quick.
Yep.
In a sea kayak, although it was a double, so it was a bit faster. So yeah, it was a little fast forward button on the East River. Roosevelt Island was kind of a blur because we dropped down so quickly, but it was a lot of fun. And finally, the other most, aside from the story we'll talk about with the trail, the other, I'd say, most interesting paddle adventure was last fall. A friend of mine and I paddled out to a remote island off of Maine called Mount Desert Rock, which is about 25 miles south of Mount Desert Island.
Right.
There's a lighthouse there and a research station. And I'd been moderately obsessed with paddling out there for about a year, and knew that it would be a bit risky just because it's the high seas. And in order to get there, you have to paddle at least 15 miles open water one way. So we made a plan, and we got out there and back, and it was quite a rewarding trip to make it to an isolated island. It was the first time I've paddled to something I couldn't see. When you first set out, it's far enough over the horizon that you have to just paddle to a compass bearing, and an hour later you can start to see a little speck on the horizon. That was pretty cool.
Yeah. So in Fiji, how did you tackle the boat issue? Did you rent from an outfitter there? Or did you take a folding kayak, or?
There's an outfitter that has kayaks on the north side of Kondavu, which is the island I went to, and I contacted the company that runs tour. The company runs tours around the world. They're based in New Zealand, and they use guides. They hire guides in Fiji to take people primarily out to the coral reef on kayak trips. And so they had mostly tandem kayaks, but also a couple of solos. And so I went, and the kayak was there, but I brought a lot of my gear, and it was super cheap to rent it. So yeah, I think it was like $200 for a month. I mean, it was like crazy cheap. And ultimately, I still keep in touch with the host family I stayed with. The host family I stayed with when I arrived and when I left on Kondavu Island, they really helped me before I went out to understand the culture and the sea, what I was getting myself into. And so although I never hired them, I certainly also, gave them a bit of money just because they really gave me a lot of their time. And that's not something they really wanted, but it felt appropriate. Right. So that was beyond the rental cost, but certainly, something I was happy to do. But yeah, the boat was there, which was very convenient. I originally was going to paddle around a different island, and I was trying to negotiate bringing a 3-piece kayak through Nigel Dennis Kayaks, but it didn't work out, and it also was going to be a bit difficult logistically to put it on the airplane.
Yep.
So, and then I thought about folding kayaks, but I'm not really accustomed to them. I really wanted something I knew pretty well as far as equipment. I just haven't used folding kayaks enough to be out in the Pacific Ocean and feel comfortable, so I didn't want to go that route. But I do recommend people check them out because they are a way to travel and paddle.
They've been crossing oceans since 1957.
Exactly.
Actually, no, since the 1920s. There was the guy who crossed the Atlantic in the Klepper in 1920 something, but then he was lost at sea when he got near the Americas. Yeah,
the Klepper is a famous boat. That's definitely one for people to check out who are interested in folding kayaks.
Klepper, of course, is German-made, long-haul kayaks. Builds a very similar boat in the United States.
Yes, yeah.
So what about paddling makes you love doing it?
First of all, I love this question. I recently took stock of all the important people in my life and realized that about 90% of the people in my life, friends, ex-relationships, they're all paddling related. And I realized that, the primary thing that I love about paddling is how many people I have encountered, how many friendships I've built through paddling in different ways. All at this point, around the world, but definitely up and down the coast of Maine at this point. I have so many friends that I met because of paddling. So it's a way, I think, and I'm a pretty independent person and definitely do a lot of things solo, but paddling is one of those things where when you're doing it solo, you build a bunch of relationships. So it's ironic in that sense, but positive in that sense. And I feel like the people I meet are similar to me because they're engaged in paddling for similar reasons, which it's an activity that layers so many interesting things, but from the physical being, using your body a certain way, being in shape, the athleticism of it, the skill side, that there's always more to learn and a better way to do something and a way to fine tune how you do it, technique and skill, the wisdom it brings. The more experience you have, the more you understand this deeper connection to what's going on around you. And that leads into another thing that's amazing about it, which is the connection to such a dynamic environment, especially the sea. It's when I teach people kayaking, I like to ask them, because a lot of people come with lake and river paddling experience, but they've never paddled on the ocean, and that's why they're taking a class. There's something inherent about the ocean to them that they think like, I need to learn more. And I ask them, like, what do you think the difference is? And what we usually land on is that it's dynamic. It's a place where there are so many layers that you can learn about, from tide to weather to the natural world and other people who are using the ocean for different purposes, and so many layers going on. Paddling is sort of this way to go about that in a very quiet way, a very deliberate and quiet way, where you're weaving through this world. And like you, I sail as well, but there's really no other way, I think, to get into that environment like paddling. You can just exist there so quietly and view it sort of from this perspective that you're not really disturbing anything. So you're seeing it from the least intrusive perspective, I think, that's possible. And at this point, yeah, it's truly one of the most important things in my life is paddling.
Right. What is special about traveling by kayak? You already touched on that essentially, but
Sure. I think that in addition to everything I said, what's special about it is that the kayak is, when you really get into it, I know we'll talk a bit about boats, but the kayak is incredibly versatile. It's really one of the best ways to be on the ocean and be secure. It's one of the best rough water boats. Really, when things get rough and you have energy and skill and experience, you can be on the ocean in conditions where other people cannot, with power boats and with sailboats. And I know that from sailing. Like, there are days when I'm in my sailboat and I get nervous and I wish I was in my kayak, because I know the limit to both, and the limit in the kayak is so much more intense as far as wave height and wind speed. It's an incredible craft when it comes to handling what the ocean can bring, sometimes unexpectedly. So I think that's one of the most special things about it. Is I know year round, in almost all conditions, that I could do a certain type of paddle trip and be on the water and be successful, because the boat is so versatile.
right. How long have you been paddling? you said you got into it when you came back from Peace Corps?
Well, I've been paddling since I was in high school.
Mm-hmm.
I became more serious about it after I returned from the Peace Corps, but I had been a competent paddler really since high school. In high school, my friend invited me on a trip he was doing with the Boy Scouts. I think I was 15, and it was a total immersion. I know this now because I teach kayaking, but it was a total immersion situation where day one we had a guide and we all started with like the wet exit, the rescue, self-rescue, T-rescue, bracing, lots of things that when I teach students, it takes, a month or so to get to all these things. But this was a day one, here we go. We're going to do all of these things. And we were young, so I think we were picking it up real quickly.
Yep.
So we started on Squam Lake in New Hampshire and did all that stuff. Practiced camping that night on Squam Lake on one of the islands.
Yep.
And then for the next 3 days, we went out into Casco Bay in Maine and camped and paddled. So I was hooked. Because I grew up in Maine and I never had a boat growing up, and I looked at the islands longingly, and now I realized, oh my God, I can get there with a kayak. Like I can put whatever I want in this boat and go to these islands, and this is just mind-blowing. So that's when I started, and over the years I certainly, we pretty quickly, my friends and I bought Derek Hutchinson's book, which at the time was the go-to kayak book, and we learned how to roll by looking at the drawings, and
yep.
we were serious about being safe and knowing what we were doing. But it wasn't really until I got back from Peace Corps that I sought out formal instruction and really wanted to learn more and be on the water a lot. So those are the two answers. The one answer is 24 years. The other answer is probably 7 years.
Uh-huh. Switching focus to the Maine Island Trail. In 1 to 3 sentences, please tell us why we should want to experience the trail. What makes this trail, or as you said, it's called a trail. It's a different idea than hikers are sometimes used to, but what makes it special?
There are so many things that make it special. We touched on a little bit how, with what you just said, it's a bit loosely defined, which gives you the ability to be creative with it and see particular things that you're interested in as far as coastline and communities along the way and what the natural world has to offer. That's different depending on how you draw the lines. It also is unique in that you can make it last different amounts of time, and I know you have a few questions about that coming up, but you can make it a month, you can make it much less depending on your reasons, but that's certainly a special thing about it. But ultimately, what makes it worth going out into in the first place is, in my opinion, if you travel the East Coast, from Florida up to Maine, no offense to the rest of the East Coast, but when you get to Maine, it's different. It's suddenly a transition from primarily sand, a lot of sand and a lot of bar islands and the intercoastal waterway and pretty heavily populated areas, to this granite shoreline it's long peninsulas, it's archipelagos, it's super interesting rocky cliffs and ledges, and suddenly the East Coast, when you get to Maine, it becomes so detailed and interesting, and it's very worth getting under those cliffs in a kayak in particular and looking up, and then the communities along the way. And Maine is a place where we have, especially as you go farther northeast, we have true fishing communities, places where people are living off of the ocean. Now, of course, there's always going to be a bit of tourism involved as well, but people you encounter who really have this relationship with the natural world that almost feels like you're in a place with a more indigenous culture, people who are really connected to what the ocean is doing that day and how they're going to approach it and what the resource is that they're after and how they're going to keep it sustainable. That kind of stuff it happens along the Maine coast in a way that I haven't really experienced in other places along the East Coast. And I talk primarily about the East Coast because I really have spent limited time on the West Coast, so I don't want to compare. But that's what's special. It's to give a good example, I led a trip last year up in Muscongas Bay, which is a unique place in Maine. I highly recommend people check out. And the people on my trip were two high school students from Belgium, and they had come to visit a friend that they knew who had been over as an exchange student with them. And I asked them, because we started the trip where we launched and we started paddling into Muscongas Bay, and I asked them about their experience in the United States. And they said they had arrived in Boston the night before and then driven to Maine, pretty much slept on the way, woke up and came to this trip. And I realized that this was the first piece of the United States they'd ever experienced was Muscongas Bay and Maine. And it just occurred to me, if this is your impression of the United States, like you are going to love the United States. And I just thought of all the other places they could have been where their impression would have been very different. And that was one of those moments where it occurred to me, like, this is a place people need to experience. This is part of our country, and it feels incredibly special and unique. So that's a place when we talk about if you have time constraints and you really need to pick and choose, I highly recommend Muscongas Bay, now that we're on the topic, as a destination.
Yeah, I mean, simply put, the Maine coast is spectacular.
That is the simple way to put it, yeah.
It's incredibly beautiful. And as you're saying, it's wild in a way that people don't think of the East Coast of the United States being.
Absolutely. Yeah.
How did you learn about this trail?
I grew up on the coast of Maine. I knew the coast pretty well from traveling by land and looking out at the coast or standing on it. But growing up, I didn't spend a lot of time on the water. When I was a kid, we would get on the water by taking the ferry and just riding it around. And that was a way to see the islands. And in Casco Bay, there's a pretty active ferry service. So we would take the mail boat, and it would take us out for about 2 hours and stop at the islands. And sometimes we'd run off and run back on the ferry to say we'd been on that island. And I didn't know the portions of the coast beyond Acadia National Park until very recently. So my understanding of the coast beyond Acadia was all through books. I used to be really interested in lighthouses and ships, and so I had books about the coast of Maine, and I would look at all the pictures and think I'd love to go there one day. I'd love to be out at places like Idaho that are way out at sea and look so different from Casco Bay, which is what I was used to. And over time, I learned a lot more by becoming a guide and doing work with different companies. So I would particularly go to Castine and work with Castine Kayak Adventures and lead trips around Castine and down in Stonington, which are beautiful places. Then working with Mid-Coast Kayak, which is Muscongas Bay, and spending a lot of time there, and doing some other trips, traveling to different places on the coast. And then with friends, of course, traveling up and down and paddling sections of the coast, camping. And in 2016, my friend and I section paddled from New Hampshire up to Winter Harbor. And that was through different seasons. So we saw it really in all the different seasons. And that was when I started to actually use the trail per se and go through by water entirely. And it wasn't until this year that I finally did the coast entirely.
Mm-hmm.
And at that point, I knew intimately the entire thing, just because so many people I know had traveled the trail entirely, and I heard all the stories, and I put it all together in my mind and studied. But I've also had a great relationship with the Maine Island Trail Association, and I've learned a ton from them about which islands they recently had acquired and what projects they were working on as far as new campsites. And so I knew all of the updates about the trail itself and what was going on. And so it's been a process from being a kid and growing up on the coast all the way to being involved in a professional capacity and really understanding it because it's part of what I do.
Right. Did you through paddle, so to speak, the entire Maine coast this year?
I did. And one thing I should note, and then we'll get into the nitty gritty, but my goal was actually to do it as fast as possible. And I researched whether or not there had been a speed record before. And there was some word of mouth that some people had tried to do it fast. And so I had some figures of, what I thought people might have done it in as far as time. And I had my idea of what I could do it in time-wise. But for me, being a professional guide and really, a kayak instructor, I wanted this added challenge of how do I have the time and the privilege of seeing this place in detail because I go up and down the coast and I can access it. So I'm not as interested this trip, my thought was in absorbing all the little detail. I wanted to see, can I use my knowledge and skill to actually do this as a race essentially against myself, and so that's this year was when I finally did that. It was in August, so I started in Newcastle, New Hampshire. So the goal was go from New Hampshire to Canada as quickly as I could.
Right.
So that was, but in doing so, I traveled the whole coast in one shot. So
right.
But that was the first time I've done it, and it was very special to finally to do that because it's something it's a very good goal, I think, for any sea kayaker to do the entire coast of Maine, however that person wants to do it. I think it's a cool adventure to do for a lot of reasons.
And hiking, it's called a fastest known time, or an FKT.
Exactly, yeah. Yeah.
Did you do that alone, or did you do it with someone else?
I did it alone, and I did it unsupported. Mm-hmm. So, and that was also important to me. I wanted to be able to make on-the-fly decisions and just push it. And I just, being a guide and instructor, I know that when you're with someone else, especially being trained and kind of taking care of people, that I just wouldn't be able to do the same things that I did if I had someone with me, just because I would be hyper aware of what was going on for them, and I would want to make decisions with them, and I knew that I was going to have to push it pretty hard and potentially put myself at risks that I wasn't necessarily willing to put other people in. So
right. Yeah, I can understand that.
And also I just wanted to be alone for a while. Yep. So it's sometimes hard to do, right?
Yep. So how many statuette miles is it approximately?
Well, that's back to our original conversation. Totally depends on how you slice it. But if you cut off all the corners,
which I assume you did.
I cut off all the corners I could. It's a little over 200 nautical miles, so about 230 statute miles.
Yep. And how long did it take you?
I ended up, the official time was 4 days, 7 hours, and 17 minutes.
Wow.
So I was moving.
Yes. Wow. What other sorts of boats did you find yourself sharing it with? Now, this is 2020, so there's a pandemic underway. You can tell us whether that had an effect on who else was out there. But obviously, you're in a kayak, which is about the smallest craft that's going to be doing this. As you said, that doesn't mean it's the least seaworthy by any means.
Hmm.
But what would you say is the mix of boats that are out there and actually doing the Maine Island Trail?
Well, I agree. Your instinct is right that 2020 and the pandemic has increased the number of people on the water, whether that be with their own boats or on tour boats, not cruise ships. They're not allowed this year, but certainly tour boats. I'd say when it comes to using the trail, the typical boats that you encounter outside of kayaks are sailboats and small power boats, and then cruise sculls. There's quite a few. It's a, the sea kayak community is small. The ocean sculling community is smaller, but they exist, and they're pretty hardcore folks because it's a very skillful activity in my opinion to be confident out on the ocean in an ocean scull. But they're fast and they can really cruise. So you'll encounter those folks, and you certainly have the traditional rowing community, which also a highly respectable activity just because of the physical strength it takes. But I've seen more and more people rowing dories, which seems like an increase. I think a lot of people are getting interested in that open rowboats.
Uh-huh.
You'll see canoeists. I think people have begun the canoe community is similar to the kayak community, I think, in where there's a melding of whitewater and open water skill and equipment and technique. And you'll see that canoeists have begun to put float bags in canoes to make them more seaworthy so they don't sink.
Right.
So I've noticed a very significant increase in open water canoeing, which I think is pretty awesome. Especially, I've even seen people who have war canoe style canoes, big, fast, multi-person canoes, and I think it's
outrigger.
Sometimes none if they're super wide, but yeah, I have seen with outrigger. And then, as you know, it sounds like you're pretty knowledgeable about paddle craft, but the Hobie Cat, that kind of thing or the Hobie, sorry, not the Hobie Cat, that's the sailboat. The Hobie, the one that you can paddle, and sail. Those are getting very popular.
Yeah.
And also fishing kayaks are huge now. That's a huge industry, and I think a lot of people use the trail to fish and kayak. And certainly paddleboarding is real big now, and there have been people who have paddled the entire Maine coast with paddleboard, which is quite an accomplishment because it takes a lot of skill to be out on the open ocean in a paddleboard and really move along and be safe. But there's a lot of really skilled paddleboarders now, so it doesn't surprise me that it's been done. That's really the big stuff. And then, you mentioned boats that are using the trail, but then of course you encounter a multitude of boats that are on the trail, but not particularly traveling it. And that the most common, of course, is the lobster boat in Maine. I mean, everywhere you go, there's a lobster boat.
Yep.
And the lobster person, the lobster man, woman, or, those folks are one of your best resources when you're on the coast. So as paddlers, we maintain the best relationship we can with that community.
Right.
So those are the common ones.
Yeah. I know the Hobie Adventure Island has, for instance, in the Everglades Challenge, which is this annual adventure race down in Florida, that has become one of the most common boats down there. I think it's almost 50% of the total is the Hobie Adventure Islands.
Whoa! Wow.
If I was looking, because as you said, you can paddle, pedal, and sail all at the same time if you want on that boat. It's not necessarily the fastest boat out there, but it you don't get stiff.
For sure. And for people who want to who want versatility, and that could be because of a physical reason. You may not feel like you're in shape to paddle the whole day. It may be because of the conditions you expect to be in. I think having versatility can be a really good thing.
Yeah. And of course it has outriggers, which
Yep.
is reassuring to a lot of people.
Sure.
Did you have time constraints when you were doing this?
I didn't. I had just quit my full-time job, which I had. Yeah, so I quit August 8th. I left my job, and then August 10 I started. And the real time constraints were actually when I was training, just because I was still working and I needed to do a lot of physical training. But for the trip, I opened up the month of August. Really, I mean, I planned on being done by the end of August, but I didn't have any constraint other than the clock I was racing against. So
for someone traveling by kayak and following the same route as you, but going at a more modest pace, what would a normal time frame be for covering the trail? The 230 miles, right? If we're talking stature, which is what most people are familiar with, which is, let's translate here, about 375 kilometers, I think you could say.
Nice work. A true international man. Got the kilometers down. Well, first, I'd say that the route I took itself is not something you would do unless you were actually trying to go fast. There's a few corners I cut that I would not recommend cutting for safety reasons unless you really know what you're doing and have an interest in saving time. So I would add a few miles to that for the person who is doing the trail efficiently but not super fast. So I'd say looking at more like, we'll just say 300 statute miles. And I'd say the competent paddler would probably end up doing it in like 2.5 weeks, maybe to a month, depending on the conditions. As most people know, it's very weather dependent. So
yeah,
particularly wind. In a sea kayak, the wind will make or break your route, your time. So the more days you're out there, the more chance you have of having days where you aren't going to make much progress. Yep. So I think so I'd say that, well, I'll put it this way. One person I know did it in 18 days, another did it in 5 weeks. So, and they're both competent people and paddlers. And so they just stretched it out or shortened it depending on what they were looking for. But I think that if somebody were to try to set aside time to do it, they would probably want to set aside at least 3 weeks just to really give time to let the weather pass if it needs, and also just, especially if they haven't been on the Maine coast much, just to really each day, plan where they're going to go and have backup plans and have a safe place to stay at night. I'd say starting with 3 weeks, if someone can set that aside, that would be a good chunk of time. But it is, you see, it's a wide range of times you could do it in, and it's very weather dependent.
What are the
considerations? Sorry for the vagueness of the answer, but
no, that was not vague. That, I mean,
okay.
Because there are so many variables, and as you said, it's not something one does in a straight line. So that this is a trail that is defined by the stops. It's water after all. So it's one's not following a trail on the ground, which is in a sense the beauty of it. That the trail is simply connecting the dots in the manner you choose, right?
Yeah, exactly.
What would you say the best season is for doing the Maine Island Trail, or what are the limitations to the season, and what are the considerations that would affect one's choice of timing for doing this?
I would say for anyone who either puts himself in a competent, but not maybe expert paddling range, that summer is certainly going to be a goal because of the benefit of the temperature of the water and the air. But also, really for anyone, a big consideration is that in the summer, particularly the late summer, the prevailing wind is a southwesterly, which
Uh-huh.
will be a tailwind
Go north.
if you go up the coast. And that's one of the biggest considerations, and also that in the summer the average sea height is the lowest.
Okay.
However, for people looking for interesting challenges who are competent or advanced paddlers, I think getting outside of summer, you can have quite an adventure as long as you do your homework, because the coast, you can paddle the coast in any month, and our paddling community here in Maine, we paddle every month of the year, and you can have some incredible, a good example is a friend of mine, paddled out to one of the Maine Island Trail islands in February with his cross-country skis, and then cross-country skied the island, and then camped, and then paddled back. And that's the kind of adventure, some people who are good outdoors people really might want. So, but as far as doing the entire coast, I would recommend really thinking about the prevailing wind, because paddling into a headwind for 3 weeks is probably going to wear you down physically and mentally. So I recommend late summer.
Yep.
So August, September-ish.
You've touched on the culture along the trail, but are there more cultural or historical factors that you would give special mention to?
Yes. The coast of Maine has a history of the Wabanaki people, the indigenous folks who lived here and still live here. A lot of the names along the coast remain Wabanaki and Abenaki, and super interesting to study that a bit and the translations of what island names are and what they mean, and how many indirect translations there are to island names that are all interesting. One example is Seguin Island off of Popham Beach, which is a popular spot and a great place to paddle to. Seguin has, I think, like 7 translations depending on how you interpret it. That simple word Seguin can mean, probably the most interesting one is, it can mean place where the sea vomits, but it can also mean high point. It can also mean last island out to sea, or lonely island. And it's all of them are true when you spend some time in and around the island. So I love to think about the Wabanaki and Abenaki and how they existed in these islands and why they named them the things they did. And you can find interesting historical evidence of where they lived, like shell middens, where they deposited shells after they ate them, tetraglyphs, all sorts of interesting evidence of when they were here. So that's a cool layer to kind of layer on if you have the time to read about it and talk to folks from that community.
So these tribes that were here historically, and I assume we're talking about colonial times and earlier, those tribes, what was their primary subsistence strategy? Were they focused on fishing and gathering other seafood?
Yeah. And it was really from the sea. They were, at least, obviously along the coast, that was
right.
Very intimate with the ocean.
Okay. What sorts of boats did they use?
They were open boaters, to my knowledge. They were not using, Inuit style kayak. They were using canoe. But that's my understanding. Certainly, I'm not sure what it evolved into maybe later, but they were masters of the open boat. I think maybe because Maine, they were throughout Maine, and Maine has huge rivers as well, and it was probably a really versatile boat.
Yeah. Well, can you describe the kayak you used for us?
Absolutely. So I used a boat made by Seaward Kayaks out of, I think it's Vancouver, and it's called the Quest, which I love the name, first of all. Love the word quest and all its meanings, but the Seaward Quest, I think it's had a few iterations now, but the one I own is I think it's a 1994. So it's one of the earlier models, but I'm pretty sure the hull itself has been the same over the years, but they've changed the deck profile.
Uh-huh.
It's 19-foot Kevlar expedition kayak.
Right.
So, right off the bat, paddlers would know that's a fast boat. It's 19 feet and probably about 22 inches wide. So
Yeah.
it's got some speed. It has a lot of storage capacity, and it's very comfortable. I actually bought one originally. I bought a Seaward Quest last year because my friend Tom Berg, who's a big popular guy in the paddling community, he had one for sale for like $200, old fiberglass one, and I was like, I'll buy that. So I bought it and I fixed it up and I did a race with it and I won the race. I was like, ooh, this boat's, it's pretty fast. So then I saw a Kevlar one pop up for sale on Craigslist. I went and bought it down in Rhode Island just because I figured I like this boat and I should get a Kevlar one, a little lighter, and sold the other one to my friend, and I love it. I have a few different kayaks, but it's the one I'll choose for camping or traveling quickly. And it's a beautiful design. And I contacted Seaward after I did this trip and just told them, I'll write something up about this because I'd love for you to have just like a story about the boat and the trail. And so I'm working on that. They were really appreciative of that.
So you gave us some idea, but what is it like in relation to other boats that one might use for the trip? And I guess we can stay with kayaks and canoes in that question. But
sure. So the average sea kayak is about 16.5 feet long when you look at true sea kayaks. And so if you're just sort of out there buying and maybe you're new to the sport, you're probably getting steered towards something that's an average of 16.5 feet, which is a versatile length because it's maneuverable, but it's fast enough. I'd say for the trail, if someone's doing the whole trail, they are more likely going to be in something 17 feet or a little longer because it's just going to give them a bit more speed and tracking over time.
Right.
But it's certainly been done in shorter boats, and there's nothing wrong with a shorter boat. The one consideration is just speed. Like in my opinion, once you dip below like 13 feet, you want to be concerned about not being fast enough for some of the winds and currents that might pick up and not being able to break through some of the conditions that you might encounter unexpectedly. So I would just say to people considering, if you don't really know how to sprint in a boat, if you don't really feel good about your skill level, then don't dip below 13 feet if you're going to do a long ocean adventure. I'm not sure if everyone would agree with that, but it's kind of my opinion. But
I hope
yeah,
people will forgive any inaccuracies, but I'll try to translate those into metric right off the top of my head here.
Sure.
13 feet would be about 4 meters. 16.5 feet is almost dead on 5 meters. And your 19-foot boat is probably it's just under 6 meters.
Okay, cool.
Or it's
Yeah.
16. Yeah, it's getting close to 6 meters. And your 22-inch beam would be about 55 centimeters wide. So that's a narrow boat.
Yeah. And one thing I'll mention also is I'm personally a big fan of the tandem kayak, and for a lot of reasons, I think the tandem is an amazing thing in the paddling world. So for folks who are traveling with multiple people, whatever your skill level, the tandem can provide big advantages. The particular ones are like your overall speed can be faster. It's versatile in the sense that one person can be taking a break, taking photos, while the other person continues the momentum paddling. It's a way to stay together for safety reasons, if that's a consideration. You're in the same boat. They're traditionally more stable. The initial stability is much greater. So if you if you want that, it's something worth exploring. And then, there are people who use a tandem solo because it gives you a huge storage capacity, and you can still push it along at an appropriate speed. So it is a consideration if you think like I really want to pack a lot of stuff, I'm going to be out there a long time. The tandem kayak is something to explore and just practice paddling it by yourself. But yeah, I'm a big fan of the tandems. And when you get into that, you're looking at usually like a short tandem is 17 feet, but I'd say the average one is about 20, and you get up to about 22 feet. So they get much bigger than solos.
Right. Yeah.
And then, you're a folding boat person, but things like the Klepper can come in a tandem size as well. So if you're looking at folding boats, you can certainly get a double as well.
Yeah, the most common Klepper or long haul has a similar model is the 5-meter double, and that is the boat that was the stock Klepper used by Hans Lindemann to cross the Atlantic in 1957, I believe, the first kayak to cross the Atlantic Ocean. Both long haul and Klepper have recently been introducing slightly longer models of their double. They've stretched them a bit over the last few years, and so that gives a little more space so that your paddles don't hit each other if you're not as experienced.
Right, and yeah, in talking about ocean crossings, it's worth mentioning too that one of the most bizarre and amazing kayak crossings was Ed Gillette's crossing of the Pacific from,
yes,
I think it was Monterey to Maui in 1986, and he did that in a double. It was a Necchi Tofino, which you can still find them around. But just an example of how the tandem, in that case, it gave him a traditional kayak, but he had the space to store 68 days worth of food and supplies. So
yeah,
there is a subset in the paddling community that, you use the tandem solo. So something to explore.
Yeah. Did you camp on your trip? I mean, the Maine Island Trail is a system of campsites, but did you camp all the way through on the 4-day trip that you did?
I camped the only night I didn't camp was the first night. I landed right near my home where my parents live, so I took advantage of that and slept in a bed the first night, but the other nights I camped.
Right.
And I did not, I actually only ended up using one island that is a Maine Island Trail Association island, but I did camp along the way.
Right. Did you use any equipment that is different from your usual setup in doing this?
Yes, the most significant, because I was paddling long days. The longest day I paddled about 14 and a half hours. I needed to be eating a lot of calories, and the kayak I used has a shelf under the front deck. So when you open the spray skirt, you reach in, and there's actually a fiberglass shelf, and I would just pack it full of apples and marshmallows and protein bars so that I could easily just reach in and eat. So that was one slight modification. And then I carried a sea anchor, which is not a typical thing that a sea kayaker may take, although if you read some books, they certainly talk about them as gear if you're doing big crossings. I didn't end up using it, but I did bring it for emergencies. If I ended up with a heavy following sea and low energy, I would have thrown it out and slowed myself down. That was really the first time I've ever had a sea anchor with me. And otherwise, I set up a hydration system that was atypical for me. I put a 2.5 gallon dromedary behind my seat with a tube coming up so that I could drink. And that's just like way more water than I normally would have right behind my seat. But I wanted to not have to stop and refill even from my own kayak, I wanted to just have enough water for a few days, like right behind my seat. But otherwise, everything else was, typical. And because I guide and I teach kayaking, I have a lot of gear that maybe, some people might not have, just because I'm often taking care of other people. So I already carry a bunch of stuff that just by habit that maybe is overkill if you're alone, but I kind of kept most of it anyway, just because I'm used to having it.
Right.
So, and that's like some of the, and I recommend these two things for everyone, but like a marine radio and also Garmin Explorer InReach, that device.
Right.
And
the InReach is a GPS locator, right? So you can send your location, or someone can check your location and find you.
And I bought that thing before I went to Fiji because it has satellite connection. You can go anywhere in the world, and really one of the best features is you can text phone numbers from it and receive texts. Yeah, and so like if if people are just want to check in with you, you can send text.
Send text messages via satellite, right?
And it obviously has a map, so like if you do get lost, you can double check. And then it's got SOS buttons, so you can do like an EPIRB style alarm if you need. But yeah, that's something if somebody's serious about going off the grid and paddling, I would consider it. It's waterproof, it's super durable device. It's not very expensive to maintain a subscription for it, so
annual subscription, right?
Yeah,
and then it's a GPS based device, but it also, the satellites it connects to, in other words, when you're out of reach of cell phone towers, you can use this. And of course, there aren't cell phone towers in the middle of the ocean. So when you're over the horizon from a cell phone tower, you can still communicate, call for help, etc., using one of these. And as you said, send texts when you're not on the grid and arrange something, or make sure that people know where you are.
Yeah.
Particular skills, knowledge, abilities that you would recommend that people have in order to undertake this sort of an adventure? And I would guess there's a range of possibilities here.
Yeah, with sea kayaking in general, I think the most important thing is to know rescues, because the sea kayak is only really a rough water boat if you know how to get back into it if you capsize and wet exit from the boat. There are plenty of people who hit the water and they haven't actually ever attempted to get back into a kayak. And even if you are a terrible paddler, as far as your forward stroke and your turning, I think if you can just start with really getting over the fear of capsize and the wet exit, assuming you have a spray skirt, that's something to get used to. Opening a spray skirt before you come out of the boat while you're upside down, that can be super intimidating for most people the first few times they try it. I would say that no matter where you're going, not even just on the ocean, but big lakes, anywhere you're not really a comfortable swimming distance from shore, you're going to want to know how to get into your boat if you've come out of it. And that is a thing that I highly recommend people learn through a class where they do it, not just watching videos or reading in a book, because it takes muscle memory, it takes overcoming a lot of stress and fear, and it takes a lot of practice. So I would, no matter what the goal is, if you're getting at all offshore, I highly recommend starting with rescues. How do I handle being out of my boat? And if you're going with a group, how do I rescue someone else? And how does it feel to be rescued by someone else? So doing assisted and solo rescues. And there's variations on how to do that. And that's why it's good to go, learn from an instructor, because they will show you different variations. And so that's the biggest thing.
Yeah. And of course it applies to any boat. It applies to kayaks, canoes, sailboats, sailing dinghies or larger sailboats.
Right.
The same
No, yeah,
principle applies. Uh,
sure. Yeah. What does it feel like to capsize a sailboat? Absolutely. How do you get it back up? But yeah, and I want to emphasize like it can be really frightening to intentionally flip yourself upside down in a kayak the first few times and even later. So that's why you've got to practice, because you really don't want to have to try to figure it out in the worst case scenarios, because you just won't have the energy and the muscle memory to figure out how to do it.
right.
Not to mention the balance. So yeah, that's number one. And then I would say, this kayaking, like any other physical activity, you can always be learning more. No matter how good you think you are, there's more to be learned and more to practice. I would just say, being someone who spent a lot of time self-teaching and learning from books before I actually started taking instruction, I would just recommend taking instruction from a real life person, because first of all, you don't want to get lost in your own ego and think, you're learning and you know all these things, when in reality you've kind of been in a vacuum, and you may have figured out what works for you, but you haven't ever actually been assessed and given feedback. But yeah, having somebody observe you and just impart feedback and coaching, and it's so, so valuable, because there really are standards now. There's standards about technique and safety with technique and just best practices. And there are just so many good instructors out there. And it's really not that expensive in the grand scheme of things to take classes. It's done most places in a way that's affordable. So I would just really recommend, if you can, learning in person. And then if you do want to go to the internet, just there's good videos and there's not so good videos. And I would just recommend that you look at the right channels if you're going to be looking at techniques, and I can certainly recommend some for folks who maybe are like yourself, maybe you're overseas and you're not really in a spot where you're able to take classes, but you want to learn by watching. There's different scenarios where you might, I have students too where I'm like, let's do this today, and then I'm also going to give you a link to some videos, because I think it's good to watch also, like any athletic activity, because your mind can capture the motion through watching.
Right. Getting to and from this trail, and so someone might be coming from, there are a number of possible scenarios here. Someone might arrive in their own car with their own kayak on top, or someone might fly into Boston from Europe and be hoping to do this, but need to figure out ahead of time how they could get the logistics together. So how did you manage access to the coast with the boat?
One thing that's good news is that the Maine coast is highly accessible, I think, compared to other spots. No offense to Connecticut, but using Connecticut as an example, you may want to get to the ocean and you can't really figure out how, just because of the way it's developed over time. But at Maine, you have public access up and down the coast. The best way to, or maybe I should say one of the best ways to look at that is the Maine, some pronounce it gazetteer, the other is gazetter, but it's the map book that's produced by Delorme. I don't know.
Yeah.
Delorme, does Delorme still exist? Garmin.
I'm not sure, but I know the book you're talking about.
Right. I'm not sure if it still says Delorme on the cover or Garmin, but same idea, same book. And the book is a beautiful book of maps that shows you coastal access really well. The big consideration if you're traveling in to Maine is, where do you park? Because if you're going to leave your vehicle for several weeks, you're going to want to really know.
Yes.
And if you don't have a vehicle, then how do I get my boat and my gear to the shore? But getting to the shore itself is not going to be super challenging. Really, in any section of the Maine coast, there are public boat ramps that you can use, and just follow like basic consideration of staying out of the way of boats launching on trailers. And there's usually beaches nearby that you can use, like next to the boat ramps. I would suggest if somebody was coming from out of state, contacting one of the paddling companies along the coast to ask about, give sort of your itinerary and ask you about access and parking, depending on where you want to start. Most people who want to do the whole coast are obviously starting down around Portsmouth, New Hampshire, or Kittery, Maine, and so you would want to contact the people down there. And one way to look at who is active right now along the coast of Maine is there's a organization I'm involved with called Maine Association of Sea Kayak Guides and Instructors, and we have a website where it shows all the participating outfitters where they are and gives contact info. So you can, I would contact them, because sea kayaking companies in Maine are really open to discuss, without trying to sell you something or try to get you on a tour. Like they'll definitely just want to discuss like your plan and where you could park, and want to help you out without it needing to be a business transaction. I think that it's one of those communities where we really would want to like jump in and participate, just out of interest in paddling. So this, it's mostly good news. You can get to the coast. You just kind of have to figure out what you're leaving behind, and is it safe, or is it going to get towed away, or
The access is good. You're not going to be able to take a train to the access. You're going to have to use a private car.
Mm-hmm.
And
Although
logistics of what to do with that private car become much of the issue.
Yeah, now that you mentioned train, though, we do actually have a train from Boston that arrives in Dover, New Hampshire, which isn't far from the beginning of the trail. So in theory, you could take a train to Dover and then actually get to Kittery or Portsmouth. It's about, it's only like less than 10 miles, I think. So
yeah.
But obviously you'd have to have gear.
So you gave us some leads on books and maps, and actually in terms of the information on the trail itself, you said when we were starting that joining the MITA organization, you get access to their smartphone app, and I think what other information do they have to give you to help you with the logistics?
They have a hard copy of a guide to the whole coast, which includes several pages on, like, when you lead into a section of the coast, they divide it up by sections. It will tell you considerations, so everything from safety to wildlife, what's going on, even a little bit of history about that section of the coast. And then it'll go into the islands themselves and show you maps and details about where to land, where to camp, who might be on the island as well, if it's an island where someone lives. And it's a very good book to have with you in case you don't get access to the app. It's easy to flip through. It's spiral bound, so you can open it easily. But MITA once again is Maine Island Trail Association. MITA is also a group of people who, back to what we were just talking about, you can ask them questions and they want to help. There's so many instances where people either wanted to do an expedition or had just started an expedition and ran into trouble and contacted MITA, and they want to kind of keep people safe but also promote the trail, and they'll help. They'll give you all kinds of information additional to what you would get with a membership. Just by reaching out, they will certainly connect you with the right resources and other people you might want to talk to. So I cannot speak highly enough about MITA. They are really a group of people who care about the Maine coast and care about access to it, and leave no trace ethics, and doing, like, experiencing the coast in a way that's safe and that you have a full experience. So there's my MITA plug in full.
Sounds good.
Give them a call.
Yep. Any other safety, security, health concerns We talked about self-rescuing in a boat, but any other sorts of concerns that need to be considered? Wildlife, of course, sea life. Concerns about when you're on islands. I mean, rattlesnakes. I don't know. What else would you throw out there for people to think about that they wouldn't necessarily think about?
Well, first I'll just say that one of the philosophies we have teaching about sea kayaking is, if you kind of think of these three categories, if you think about skill, equipment, and conditions as three separate categories, and you can kind of get away with a deficiency in one if you have the other two. But when you start to have a deficiency in two or more, you can run into trouble. So if you think about, like, what is my skill level, what are the conditions, and what is my equipment, start there and fan out. But I'd say, we did spend a lot of time on self-rescue, but there's a ton of other stuff. I would say the biggest thing outside of just skill is, like, what's going on in the weather and the sea, and how do you plan to what is the language you're reading to understand that? So what is the forecast you're reading? Where are you getting your data about what's currently happening as far as conditions? And do you get it? Like, can you interpret that in a way that makes sense? For instance, if you're looking at, like, we have data buoys all around the world that tell you what's currently happening, right? What's the wave height, the wind speed, the wind direction, the swell height versus the wind wave height, the water temperature, this list of information. It's good to be at the point where you can glance at that, and like any other language, it tells you something, right, that you interpret. And that relates to, like, do I want to paddle today? And if I do, what will it be like? And I've been in that before, or I've never been in that. And then the forecast itself. What does it mean? What does it mean to me on my trip? So not just looking at the terrestrial forecast, not just looking at what's the temperature and is there a sun or is there a little angry cloud, but looking more at the marine forecast, right? What is the sea height? What is the wind direction? And knowing what that means. That's super important to sea kayaking the coast of Maine. And then, of course, the tide. The tide in Maine is very significant. So you want to know what it's doing and what that means to your trip. So that's the kind of the condition side. And then you mentioned the wildlife side. Fortunately, most of the coast of Maine, the considerations with wildlife are more about protecting the wildlife and not yourself. So a lot of that is the leave no trace ethics. Like, how do I not scare all the seals off a ledge? Like, it may seem cool to go check out the seals because they're cute and they're on the ledge, but if I scare all of them off the ledge, then have I just, killed a seal pup by accident because one of them got crushed when the seals were rushing off the ledge, or, that was their chance to get all their body heat for the day. Did I just ruin it? Considerations like that. I'll just put this out there. This year, as maybe you heard, we had our first confirmed shark fatality in Maine, and there's been a lot of talk about it, and it's certainly impacted the paddle industry. This happened off Harpswell in Casco Bay, and it was an ocean swimmer who got attacked by a great white shark. So I won't sugarcoat it and say, like, it's shark-free waters. It's not as common as Cape Cod or other places you may go that you would encounter a shark, but they do now, thanks to ocean warming and food patterns. We have sharks in Maine, so you do want to know that and be comfortable with what that means. As paddlers, it's very rare that a shark would actually attack and harm a kayaker, just because they go by smell and they go by texture, and a kayak doesn't smell like anything, and it's usually pretty solid, so even if they were to bite it, they probably would immediately leave. But if you have an open wound and you're bleeding into the water, who knows? But I won't spend a ton of time on that because it's really a small consideration, but it's a big fear. So for a lot of people. Yeah,
that's the thing. The shark concern is a big fear, but statistically, it's vanishingly small as a threat.
Right.
So that's something to really be clear about.
Yeah. And then I'd say once you're on land, I often say when I'm teaching kayaking that almost all of the injuries I've had where I actually had to do first aid were on land, not on the water. because when a paddler gets out of the kayak, they're either tired or they don't realize they're stepping on seaweed and slime, and suddenly they just flip backwards, fall on the ground, cut their leg open on a barnacle, and now they've got an infection concern and they're in a remote place. So thinking about like, okay, I'm on land now, but I'm still in the outdoors. I'm hiking. so
Right.
I need to keep my wits about me. Just because my day's over paddling, like I still need to be careful. And then of course, poison ivy, poison sumac, ticks.
Right.
Ticks are a huge concern in Maine. I mean, our islands have deer because deer swim to the islands, so we have deer ticks, and we have Lyme disease, and we have other illnesses that come from ticks now. So once you're on the island, you're not necessarily done for the day, right? And then I would say, we've talked a lot about leave no trace. Just also back to considering your impact. Sometimes once you're on the island, you kind of want to spread out and build a big fire and just warm up and do whatever, but realizing that the islands in Maine are all pretty small, not a lot of soil, so just continue to take care. Even when you're tired and you want to relax, just take care of what you're doing on the island, and not really like ripping trees down and setting big fires, but just low impact, no impact ideally. So those are big considerations. I'll just say also that we talked a bit about it, but the Maine coast, as remote as it is, there are a lot of boats. And if you're traveling the trail in a small boat, you do want to know the rules of the road. You want to know what other boats are doing and what are the appropriate maneuvers that you take if a boat's approaching you, or does the boat see me? I highly recommend knowing how to use a marine radio so you can talk to boats. You can do security calls when you're doing crossings. If you're in the fog, you can tell people where you are. Really think about your place in this often busy space where there's a lot of traffic. And, that's like a whole other component to an island trail, is seamanship, as we call it, just knowing all these basics about what do I do on the ocean, how do I behave, and how do I talk to people on a radio, and how do I even say maritime terms when they're appropriate. You're going to start hearing things like aft and bow and stern and lee, all these words. You want to quickly know what it means. So that's just some other stuff to study.
Assuming one has already gotten oneself to Maine, what are the costs for a trip like this? And I mean, the variables are so many here. So assuming one already has one's boat lined up, and the vehicle question, we'll count that out as well. You're camping, so it's just the supplies that you would have, and is there anything that you spend money on along the way?
I'm sure there's a range, quite a significant range, depending really on comfort. I think comfort would probably be the biggest factor, right? There's people who travel the coast and they do bed and breakfast, instead of camping. But you've obviously specified camping. I just want to throw that out there that,
right.
There's no rule about where you stay. It's your trip. If you want to splice in a bed and breakfast every now and then to take a shower and have someone else make you breakfast, by all means, splice that in there. I'd say, one of the other beautiful things about paddling is once you have the gear can be expensive, right? And you can find used stuff and cut the costs. And once you have the gear, it's so inexpensive. I mean, access is almost always free to getting on the water. The islands are free. If you join MITA, you have free access to all of their islands. You do need membership for certain islands. I actually don't know the current rules about all of that, but I would certainly check with them. I think it's $30 a year right now for MITA membership. So honestly, I just think it's worth it, because then you have that access. You don't have to check, right. And you get all those resources we talked about. So yeah, food. I mean, it depends on how you eat, but I do recommend taking a little care with what you get for food. I mean, it's easy to just buy a bunch of power bars and, try to make it cheap. Well, I guess power bars aren't the cheapest thing, but it's easy to like go cheap with food, but I do recommend really considering like a lot of the being well-rounded in what you eat, just because it is a long time and you're using your body, and you really want to think about like all the vitamins you need and protein, and I think if you're going to spend money, you should actually spend it on good food, because it's going to also make you happy. Oh gosh, but yeah, if you want to figure for how much you would spend, that's going to be tough for me. I honestly think for one person for doing the whole coast of Maine, I mean, you probably are going to still be well under $500 if you even buy good food and, buy like some extra gear you might need, buy some charts. I think it's a really the cost to experience ratio is incredibly good.
Well, you talked. My next question is, how were you able to make space for this in your life? And you did it between jobs. Where do you learn about new places to paddle or new places to experience?
Honestly, nowadays I'm kind of a satellite geek. I love looking around using the satellite imagery of the Earth. And I have also, that's why I got interested in the Fiji trip. I was literally just looking at islands, and I saw an island that looked like it would be amazing to paddle around. And it's kind of maybe a different way to do things, but I look at the texture of a place with the satellite and look at the towns and the cliffs and the reefs and just think like, what would that be like to paddle? And I recommend that for anyone who's got a little free time and a computer, just sort of looking at the satellite. It's really a resource that we have nowadays, this imagery. And then sometimes I'll see a place on a trip. For instance, my next trip that's planned is Grand Manan Island in Canada, because on the end of this trip, I looked out at it and I saw these massive cliffs that just look incredible. And so some friends of mine and I are planning to go out there next year and paddle around it, which is a pretty reasonable trip. I think it's like 30 miles total.
And that's the island that's right on the border between the U.S. and Canada, right?
Exactly, yeah, right at the mouth of the Bay of Fundy. So you get really big tides and big ocean conditions. So it does take some skill and planning to do it, but I think it's certainly been done by paddlers, and it's a reasonable trip if you do a little homework.
Right.
So yeah, sometimes you just see something, or you hear about it, of course. Somebody says, I did this, and you get interested. But I would just, you seem like this type of person too. I'd be creative and draw outside the lines. Nowadays there's pre-established trails, and not to divert from our topic, we're talking about a pre-established trail, but I do think if you're looking for adventure, sometimes drawing your own trail is kind of fun if you're careful about it.
Well, this is an interesting sort of the different, I've been talking about hiking trails before on this, and the different nature of water, where it's more free form, and there are plenty of navigable waterways as well. But
absolutely, yeah.
What is the trip that you dream of doing?
It's a very difficult question, I guess, because I have so many, but I've narrowed down. My current dream trip is actually to paddle around Sicily. It's one of the ones where I looked at the satellite and I looked at the island. I have Italian heritage, and there's just something about it that seems like it'd be so interesting. And I believe in looking around, I actually saw that somebody paddled around it in a Klepper. So just another plug for Klepper. But it just looks like it would be a very interesting place to explore by kayak. So that's my current circumnavigation dream, is just go paddle around Sicily. And then one other one that's a little more dramatic would be Sri Lanka. I actually think that would be a really cool trip, because that island just looks like it would be pretty wild and interesting. And the culture would also be really fascinating to get into. Yeah, those are kind of two big ones that I've pondered.
But circumnavigations of islands seems to be a theme here.
it's kind of a thing in paddling. If you look at the history of modern sea kayaking and you look at current paddlers, oftentimes on the resume are circumnavigations, and I think it's just a very tangible thing to do. It kind of shows, you did a complete loop of a certain place, and it, depending on the size of the island, it involves really getting into the culture of that island, right? I mean, you got to go there and camp, and it's classically just been a thing. Everything from Ireland, Iceland, Freya Hofmeister, and Australia, places that are gigantic, and it just it's just a way to have a very defined beginning and end to your trip. That's kind of my thought, is that it's very tangible.
Do you have an online presence that you care to share, or?
I am right now in a pretty low online presence phase. I haven't been on social media just for various reasons. I do have a relatively new Medium account that I hope to be posting a bit more on. It's a little bit more on the literary side, but I am going to post about this last trip, and it's just at Tideflood, Tideflood,
right,
on Medium, which is, a place to post stories, essentially. Yeah, and otherwise, now I've tried to stay offline.
Right.
I'm one of those people who's, just trying to be more in the real world. So when it comes to teaching kayaking and stuff, I do it through companies, so I don't really even have my own, website or anything like that. But we'll see. Maybe I'll have a healthy presence at some point.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for talking with us on this podcast and sharing all this information about paddling in Maine, paddling in other places, and about the Maine Island Trail.
You are most welcome. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks very much. Thank you for listening to the Trails Around the World podcast. Please visit us online at trailsaroundtheworld.com, and please join our Facebook group under the same name. If you liked this podcast, please help us out by leaving a review on your favorite podcast source, such as Apple Podcasts. This is Sky King, and I look forward to you joining us next time. In the meantime, happy trails to you, and please remember to leave no trace as you enjoy the outdoors.